Story 1. Hearing from other kids how generous their parents were. Taking them to a pediatrician, giving them basic advice, caring about their feelings, helping them out when they were struggling. Then realizing all these things weren't about going above and beyond, but rather what normal parents do. Story 2. When I was crying to my mom about my stepbrother choking me to the point I was turning red, and a bystander had to pull him off of me, she just shrugged and asked if I had done something to him. I also told my dad, and he got angry at me. Definitely messed up, but that's for sure. Story 3. I realized my family was off when my mom encouraged my brother to join the street life. Not for financial reasons, but genuinely just so she could brag. I don't even know how it's something to brag about, but hey, that's ghetto communities. I only realized it was wrong because of the TV shows and movies I saw, where the family and friends were trying to get the main character to leave the street life, not join it. Story 4. When I was told not to talk to my friends about certain things that happened at home because you don't share everything with non-family members, and they won't understand. Story 5. I went to a friend's house after school one day, and her mom called us down for dinner. I was astonished that the whole family sat down at the table and ate together, and chatted and joked and laughed. They actually seemed to be enjoying each other's company. There was no tension. No one was yelling or being sullen. No hint of threat in the air. Just a simple, fun dinner. Apparently, they did that every night. Shocking behavior. I privately thought her family was really weird for that, but once I started making more friends, I began to realize it was my family that was weird. Story 6. Lots of abuse and neglect, living in filth, mice, roaches. If something broke, oh well. We had a broken window for years. It was ridiculous. My best friend's mom used to have me bring my laundry on Friday nights in a pillowcase, and she'd wash it for me for the next week of school. I used to get physical education as my last class on purpose so I could properly shower and wash my hair with actual shampoo, not dish soap. My secret family made sure I had everything I needed from 12 to 17. They even bought my sanitary supplies because my mom would buy the cheapest pads and cut them in half for me to use. I was the only girl. When it was health week at school and they passed out hygiene kits, I took everything I could. If my well-taken care of friends didn't want theirs, I took those too. I left at 17 and never looked back. My dad was not as bad as my mom. Yes, neglectful, but he went through alcoholism and worked a lot, so we got left at home with the abuser. I did reconnect with him as an adult, and they had divorced many years before that. He genuinely was a sweet man who changed his life and was so sorry. But around the age of 14, I even stopped eating anything from the house because everything was contaminated with roaches and grime. I was big into sports, so was my best friend, so her mom would always have a salad or sandwich for me in the car, along with a juice pouch and some fruit. I ate breakfast and lunch at school with the reduced lunch program that I signed myself up for. This was in the 1980s, and some relatives later told me that they called Child Protective Services a few times, but they only counted bedrooms and never once talked to me or my brother. Child Protective Services in the 1980s was a joke. I'm glad I was secretly adopted. Story 7. I entered public school at 13. I was bullied by the kids who immediately picked up on my lack of social skills. I was as polite and pleasant to them as I would be to anyone. A month later, once I had established my first ever friend group, they told me how unusual my inability to be bothered by bullies was, citing my extraordinary ability to be unbothered by verbal abuse. Being taunted for my physical appearance wasn't unusual to me because that's how my parents spoke to me. That's when I knew my parents were different. It had never occurred to me that my parents were different because I had just always known they didn't like me and that being laughed at and called names by them was just how they treated me. Apparently, it's really unsettling to bullies when you genuinely laugh off their comments or double down and provide an even worse description of your failings without having any negative emotions around it. It made me feel very proud of myself for the things I knew I was good at and, in an odd way, provided me the confidence to be curious. My parents didn't care about me or anything I did, so I had to seek out what was important to me and accept the influence of people I genuinely respected and admired. Story 8. When I heard a classmate's mom tell my parents about how much she adored me and how much I lit up the room with my personality, and that she was glad I was friends with her daughter, I was surprised. I never heard anyone in my family speak with that level of positivity and depth about anyone, including family. I was confused as to why I could leave an impact on essentially a woman I interacted with in passing, but my parents couldn't even remember what grade I was in. Story 9. When I was in elementary school, I would go to a friend's house. Her parents and brothers were really nice to me. They never made fun of me or said hurtful things to me. Their dad never screamed at the top of his lungs if they made a mistake and never slapped any of their kids for asking a simple question. In general, whenever I went to her house, everyone was kind and pretty calm. Story 10. The first afternoon I spent with my best friend's and now partner's family, I was 6 years old. I fell and scraped my knee as 6-year-olds do. His dad rushed over and helped me up, telling me it would be okay and that I was okay and that we would go clean it up inside. I had never had an adult clean my cuts before. No one had ever taken care of me before, not since I was old enough to feed, dress, and bathe myself. I realized then that my parents were supposed to take care of me. Story 11. Whenever my aunt accused her own daughter of sleeping with her husband, who is also her daughter's dad, I was puzzled. I'm not sure what compelled her to think my cousin was sleeping with her own father, especially since she was just 16 years old at the time. But I am happy I lost contact with that side of the family. Story 12. I got to go over to a few other people's houses and realized that most people's houses really, basically, do look like the ones on TV. Sure, the furniture may be cheaper, or maybe there's a little clutter, so more in the territory of Married with Children or Roseanne. But yeah, all these other houses more resembled the houses on TV than my own. Turns out most parents aren't hoarders. Story 13. When I was probably about 7 or 8, I realized that other families spent time together on vacation. They would do activities together, and their kids didn't just spend time hanging out with staff or locked up in the hotel room. When I was a kid and we went on vacation, it was clear that it was my parents who were on vacation. We just got the privilege of tagging along. Our job was to spend as much time away from them as possible and not need them for anything. Then I realized other families also spent time together when they weren't on vacation. I never realized that other families went for walks, played together, or played sports together outside of daily survival activities. I thought kids playing basketball with their dad was only a thing that happened in movies. Story 14. My mother bathed us and dressed us up every weekend to visit my biological father's family. But my mother always kept us close to her. If any of us needed to go to the bathroom, she would take us all and wait outside the bathroom. My mother never did that when we visited her family. My biological father's brother had assaulted 2 of my cousins. My mother wanted to prevent the same thing from happening to us. Story 15. The first time in the 1980s we were doing a unit on the census, so we filled out a census form. I knew I had a big family, but under number of telephones in the home, mine was 14. The next highest was 6. Story 16. When I was at my friend's house, they just grabbed snacks from their pantry. The one at my house was always locked, and we were not allowed to get anything out of it. Things would rot. Story 17. The day my mother insisted I go to the bank with her, I didn't feel like going, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. I was 18. I accidentally slammed my thumb with the car door. It was bleeding and the nail was coming off, so I got out to take care of it. She was so angry that I wasn't going after all, that she sped off, leaving no concern for me whatsoever, then or later on. I didn't have my keys, so I was locked out. I had to walk a mile to the neighbors for help with my thumb. When I told them what happened, the look of horror on their faces told me none of that was normal. Story 18. My friend's mom did not start undressing and rolling around on the floor in front of the TV when she did not get enough attention. That was odd to me. Story 19. When I traveled across the country and spent a few weeks with my partner's family during Christmas, honestly, it was the fact that when his brother forgot to bring the stuffing to Christmas dinner, everyone reacted appropriately and in proportion to the situation. Nobody died, we just ate more of the potatoes. Sure, there was some gentle teasing towards his brother for forgetting the one item he was in charge of, but everything turned out just fine. It was such an appropriate response to such a small problem. In comparison, the preceding year at my family's Christmas, my uncle kicked my mother because they had a disagreement, and I don't even remember what it was about. There was obviously more to it than just this incident, but that's the moment where it really hit me. And then I spiraled big time. I tried to break up with him because I fully planned to kill myself once I arrived back home. I thought there's no coming back from this. My family and myself are so completely irredeemably wrong that I don't have any hope of being a functioning person, let alone part of a real family. What am I doing here? Why am I wasting everyone's time? It was a very dark moment, and nobody could figure out what was going on. But even though I seemed absolutely insane, everybody just carried on and continued trying to include me. 5 years later, we're still together, and I'm slightly less crazy. Story 20. My father had an extremely bad temper. One time when I was 13 years old, he picked me and my friend up from school, and my dad was in a really bad mood. He started screaming at me for being too stupid to know something or other. I was used to it and totally silent. When I was with my friend later, he was in complete shock. I downplayed it and I told him it's totally normal. He said, "No, it's not." And I never forgot that. Story 21. After my grandma passed away, I realized something that made my family unusual. On my dad's side, we just don't handle death traditionally. No obituary, no funeral, no social media announcement. Just the legal matters, notifying family and the person's friends, cremation or burial, and that's it. Zero fanfare. It's not the strangest thing, but it's not something any of us were specifically raised to do or believe. It started, as far as I can remember, with my great-grandma and just continued. Everyone on that side is quite anxious too, not quite enough to be bipolar, but enough to notice and trace through the lineage. Story 22. I watched Full House as a kid. Every time the kids got in trouble, the guardians would calmly talk to them and give out some sort of punishment. I always thought, I wish my parents would be like that. All they did was scream at me until I cried if I did something bad. It took me until my 30s to realize that Full House was 100% fictional. Parents didn't actually gently punish their kids. Story 23. When I spent an afternoon at my friend's house when I was about 8, her dad randomly asked us if we wanted to do anything fun, and he ended up teaching me how to play Monopoly and how to ride a bicycle. It was then that I realized that spending quality time with their kids is something that normal parents did. In our house, my parents would never do anything with us during their free time outside of going to the mall and eating out. Story 24. I was maybe 11, and my friend was supposed to spend the night at my house. I was a bit embarrassed because we could hear my family fighting, but I didn't consider it a bad fight because the walls weren't shaking and no one was throwing or breaking anything. She told me if I ever needed somewhere safe to stay, that her mom would come get me and I could stay with them. I knew her mom wasn't the most stable person in the world, but that woman took care of me from 11 to 18 anytime I needed anything. I could probably call her now, years since I've last spoken to either of them, and she would still treat me like family. Story 25. Probably around the time my stepmother put a lock on the outside of my door and would lock me in my room with a little bowl of snacks and a television that only got about 3 channels. Also, how we went to SeaWorld and they just left me in the car, at least the windows were down. Story 26. I always knew something was off in my family. I finally found out that my father had a mistress in another town. But with 6 kids to raise, my mother couldn't justify divorcing him. She only had a high school education. Story 27. Other kids wanted us to go to their house, didn't get yelled at in front of me, and their parents would come out of their room to say hi and not call their kid to the room to loudly tell them to hide the valuables. Story 28. Things were too perfect the first time I came over to my girlfriend's house. A pie cooling on the windowsill. Perfect dinner made by a well-dressed mom in makeup. Turns out my girlfriend's dad was having an inappropriate relationship with the older sister. And my girlfriend was next in line once the sister got too old. This is not sarcasm. Story 29. Earliest memories of starting school and mom always threatening me to never tell anyone what happens at home. Every school assignment that involved telling about family and home life I either didn't do or lied. Yeah, it didn't take me very long to realize how messed up my life was growing up. Story 30. My parents are good people, but they do not have any friends. They are self-isolated in my opinion. They raised good kids and instilled morals in us, but they are ghosts in the community. It is kind of weird to be social outcasts yet upstanding citizens. Story 31. Probably the third story of pedophilia within the family. The following two involving family friends were less shocking after the pattern. Then, when one of my uncles suggested that I find a different therapist to help me get closer to the family instead of further, after being molested by another uncle for years, I knew we were in trouble.